Well, if you have your Bible with you this morning, I invite you to open it up to the book of Psalms once again. And I'd like you to join me in the same one we were in last week, which was Psalm number 139. Psalm number 139. We've had a couple of shorter class periods here, so our discussion on God and His timeless nature has been split up into several shorter parts. Ultimately, this morning I want to get to the idea that God is not bound by space. But before we move into that, I want to come back to one last implication of this discussion about God and time. What we've been saying about God and time up until this point is that God is outside of time. Okay, He is the creator of time. Before time came into being, God is all that there was, and He did not experience His life and does not experience His life as a succession of moments like we do. As we noted the last 2 weeks, eternity and timelessness has to be defined negatively in order for us to understand it, because we cannot really comprehend what it is in itself. So you have to define it by what it is not. And so we define eternity by saying there is no beginning, and there is no end, and there is no succession of moments. Now, that is basically impossible for us to understand because we know of no other way of experiencing life except for sequentially, right? One moment after the next moment after the next moment, and so on. Everything that we know and perceive has a beginning. Everything that we know and perceive has an end, and everything that we know and perceive is experienced in time. So it's no wonder that we can't really wrap our minds around this particular idea. Earlier this week, CJ and I were having a bit of a conversation about this. Some of the teens had been asking some questions in his class about creation and the dinosaurs and all that kind of stuff. It's hard to fit together when you're first getting old enough to ask some of those questions. And one of the questions that they were asking him was, well, if God created the universe and He is how the universe came into being, who then created God? Ever wondered that in your own mind? And it's a great question, and the reason they ask that question is because they cannot fathom a being who has no beginning. They cannot fathom what we have called, or what Aristotle called, the unmoved mover who has eternally existed. Every thinking person comes to struggle with this particular idea, and so that's what we have been wrestling with over the last several weeks. So with that in mind, I want to bring you to one last element before we move on to the idea of God's omnipresence. I want to wrestle just a few moments with something that we read last week from Psalm number 139 that was going to factor into our discussion here. And so if you're there in your Bible, I'd like you to read with me beginning in verse 13. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know them full well. My frame is not hidden from you. When I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Okay. So the psalmist is describing here how he came into being. And he is giving credit to God for having knit him together in his mother's womb. He's fearfully and wonderfully made, and there's nothing about him that's hidden from God. And that should be obvious because God knit him together, right? But now notice verse 16. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. That's what I want to draw your attention to here this morning. Not only is David claiming here that God created him and knit him together in his mother's womb, But he is also saying, all of my days have been ordained for me, and they are written in your book. He is speaking here of the fact that all of the future, including all of God's future plans for us, are already written. The future is foreordained. Okay? And so we see here the difference between God's experience of things and our experience of things. Because we experience life sequentially, in time, everything must unfold one thing after another, okay? But for God, who is outside of time, we have learned he's pure act, that he is unchanging. And this means from all eternity, God has been moving in action, and he has been carrying out this one ordained plan. And because he is eternal, he knows the beginning from the end. It is a set fact for him. But because we are bound by time, we can only see it as it unfolds. Okay? Now, this raises a question. Do you all want me to shut the wall over there? Is that discussion bothering you, or are you okay? You're okay? Okay, all right, very good. So all this raises a question. If all of our future is foreordained, then are we truly free? Do we legitimately have choice? Do we affect not only our future, but the future environment? And the answer, as you might assume, is yes. But there's a real trick in understanding how all of this goes together. Now, I don't have much time for this morning, since I am determined, no pun intended, to get to this discussion of omnipresence. But let me try to define for us as best as we can in as short a way as we can. We really could make a whole series of classes about this subject, but just a brief word will be enough here for this morning. So, in the previous weeks, we have talked about two things. Number one, we have talked about that God is changeless, but number two, we have talked about how God is pure act. And these two things have to go together. Otherwise, for God to be changeless would mean that he's static, that he's unmoving, right? God is a moving God. But in order for this to be true about him and he also to be changeless, it means he has to have been eternally in motion. And so the implication for that question is, okay, what does this have to do with God's eternal decree? Well, in God there is one decree, one plan, but it unfolds with many different implications, and all of our free will actions are factored into that. It is factored in from the beginning in this eternal moment of God's moving decree. So the question, of course, is how can God have one unchangeable decree and yet at the same time give us free will where we have legitimate decision-making power? Okay. The answer is the two things are actually compatible. The way that God can give us freedom and the way that we can know infallibly what will come to pass is because he has decreed these things to work through what we call secondary means. In other words, the general rule is God does not directly step in all that often and change things or affects things. He does things from time to time. But he allows things to unfold through secondary means, but even through the secondary means, he is able to know and determine what is going to happen. Now, Jonathan Edwards was a great 18th century Puritan preacher, and he had the most profound idea of how to work out this particular thing. He says to us, we always act according to our strongest desire. Okay, for example, let me give you an example. If I was to set before you a piece of chocolate cake with nice homemade vanilla ice cream.
Ooh, making me hungry.
Yes, and then I was to set before you a plate of worms and say,
Ooh.
you need to pick one, and I'm gonna I'm going to guess beforehand which one you're going to pick. You think I'm going to have much trouble figuring it out? No, of course not. Most people are going to strongly desire to have the chocolate cake and the ice cream, or they're going to, if they don't like that all that much, they're going to strongly desire not to eat a plate of worms, right? Jonathan Edwards says, everything works that way. We always act according to our greatest desire in the moment. Okay? And if you think about that, that's true. That's even true for things that appear to be against our strongest desire. For example, let me give you one that I've dealt with. Weight loss. Okay? If you set before a person chocolate cake, homemade vanilla ice cream, or let's get the worms off the table and forget them for a minute, but a plate of broccoli, okay?
Yummy, my favorite.
The person who's trying to lose weight would probably choose the broccoli, but it seems to be going against their strongest desire, because you would think their strongest desire is for chocolate cake and ice cream, right? But the fact is, if a person is going to make that choice, they have had to previously develop within themselves a very strong reason why they're going to resist eating that chocolate cake and ice cream. Whenever I started my weight loss program a year ago, my coach on this particular program made me create what he calls a why list. Okay? And the purpose of a why list is try to mold and shape your desires. So you put this list together of why you want to lose weight more than you want to eat the things that you want to eat. And so you might say things like, I'd like to look good in a suit, or I'd like to have better health, or I'd like to have more self-confidence, or I'd like to not feel so guilty about overindulgence, or all these things that you kind of try to put together so that the stronger desire is to lose weight and you choose the broccoli over the chocolate cake. And so, in fact, it appears like you're choosing against your strongest desire, because we'd all be tempted to say my strongest desire is for the cake and the ice cream. But the fact is, the only way you're going to lose weight is if you develop a desire that's even stronger than your desire to eat. And we often fail at that. I often fail at that, okay? It's a struggle. But that's not true with weight loss. It's true of every thing that we battle against. Now, most of us know this intuitively, even if we couldn't articulate it, okay? For example, those of us who have close friends or loved ones in our family, especially those of us who have children, most of the time we can predict with some degree of accuracy how they're going to act, right? If we know our children and you put them in certain kind of situations, a lot of times we know how they're going to act. Why? Well, because we know their inclinations. We know their personality. We know all the things that factor into their decisions.
And they don't want it.
And they don't want it, right. And so if that's true about us, who have very limited thinking capacity, how much more so must it be true about the God who has an infinite mind, who can factor in every single detail in specific information? That is how God can know the future and ordain the future without stripping us of our freedom. Okay? We're not a mystery to God. He knows our minds. He knows our inclinations. He knows every little detail about us. Therefore, He knows all of our actions. From His perspective, they are foreordained, even though it's also true that they are free. Okay? We only discover things as time unfolds, but God knows it in one eternal moment. Okay? All right. All that's hard to grasp. Okay? The discussion of God and time is the most difficult aspect of the attributes of God, because we just simply don't have an experience like that. Okay? But hopefully these have given you some things to think about and ruminate on. For the rest of our time here this morning, I want to now go to the flip side of this truth. Our subject here is really God's infinite nature. That's what we're studying, and we're exploring his infinite nature in two ways. When it comes to infinity in regard to time, we talk about God as eternal and timeless. But if we take the same idea of infinity and apply it to space, then we not only have to conclude that God is eternal, but that he's also omnipresent. Now, what does it mean to be omnipresent? Anybody give me a definition of that? He's everywhere all the time. Okay. Now, this is a little bit easier for us to grasp than timelessness, but it is still a stretch of the imagination for us to imagine a being who can be at all places, at all times, and his full being to be in all places, at all times. Let me give you a biblical example of this, and then we'll flesh it out a little bit. Turn with me, if you would, in your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 8. First Kings chapter 8. Here in 1 Kings, we come to a special moment in the life of Israel. Solomon is king, and under the reign of Solomon, Israel is experiencing its most prosperous years. Okay, unlike under the reign of David, they're not constantly at war with their neighbors during Solomon's reign. There is peace throughout the land. And on top of that, the kingdom under Solomon has spread out to its greatest geographical coverage that it's ever going to have. Okay, these are great times to live in Israel. It's sort of like living in the United States in the 1980s and 90s. You know, it's just there's peace, and then things are good, and everything looks pretty good. Well, if you remember, David wanted to build God a temple, because he thought it was wrong for him as a king to be living in a beautiful palace while the Ark of the Covenant, which represented God's presence, was dwelling in a portable tent, and had done so ever since the days of the Exodus, right? So God agrees to have a permanent temple built for him in the city of Jerusalem. However, he's not going to let David do it. Do you remember why he's not going to let David do it? He's a man of war, right? And there was a purpose for his war, but it's not really right for a man of such bloodshed to build God's house. And so God promises David, I will let your son do this for me. And so in these opening pages of 1 Kings, God is now honoring what he has promised David he will do. Solomon, of course, is that son of promise. He is a man of peace, thanks to God's providential care. And because of the great wealth that God has provided for Solomon, and really for all of Israel during this particular time period, Solomon takes up the task of building the temple, and it is a magnificent thing to behold. It is a temple worthy of the God for whom it is being made. I have no doubt if we could have seen it in its original state, it would have been one of the great wonders of the ancient world. But after Solomon completes the temple and he brings the ark to be placed inside the Holy of Holies, and as he does so, he's going to acknowledge something important. Even though Solomon has built this wonderful place for God to dwell, God cannot be contained by any man-made building. Okay? Not even the heavens themselves can contain God's presence. And so, really, what Solomon done is not for the benefit of God, it's for the benefit of the people, so that they have a wonderful place to come and worship and to experience God's presence. But Solomon knows intuitively God cannot be contained in such a place. So let's read this together, and then we'll see how it goes. Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the whole assembly of Israel. This is verse 22. And he spread out his hands toward heaven, and he said, so Solomon's gathered all of Israel here in Jerusalem before the temple, and he's getting ready to make this prayer of dedication. Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants, who continue wholeheartedly in your way. You have kept your promise to your servant David, my father. With your mouth you have promised, and with your hand you have fulfilled it, as it is today. Now, Lord, the God of Israel, keep for your servant David, my father, the promises you made to him when you said, you shall never fail to have a successor to sit before me on the throne of Israel. If only your descendants are careful in all they do to walk before me faithfully as you have done. And now, God of Israel, let your word that you promised your servant David, my father, come true. Now notice this, verse 27. But will God really dwell on the earth? The heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. How much less this temple that I have built? Yet give attention to your servant's prayer and his plea for mercy, Lord my God. Hear the cry and prayer that your servant is praying in your presence this day. Okay, do you see what Solomon is saying? He's saying, I have built this temple for you, and you have been faithful to your promise to my father. But even as I acknowledge all these things are true, I know no building on earth contains your presence. Not even the highest heavens contain your presence. God has allowed Solomon to do this as an act of mercy for his people, and Solomon is grateful for it. So, you see the theological point here. God may especially manifest his presence in a certain place for the benefit of his people, but the truth is no created space can contain God. Why? Because he existed before all these things came into being, and he therefore is outside of such limitations. And in fact, there is no place in all creation where he is not present. And being present there, not only is he present in part, but he's fully present. Okay? Now the question, of course, is how can that be possible? And there's actually a fairly simple answer, even though it's a little bit complex to understand. And the reason that God can be everywhere at once and his full being be found everywhere at once is because God does not have a body. He is pure spirit, and as spirit, he can be everywhere at once. Now, this is not true of any finite thing that is created. Everything that is created is finite. It has a limited nature, and everything he creates has a kind of body, a kind of substance. And what I mean by that is there is a place where such things are, and then a place where such things are not. Nothing else but God is in all places at all times in its full measure. Okay? Let me give you some examples so we can work this out in concrete terms. Let's take, for example, this chair that I'm sitting on. It obviously has a body, a structure, and it can only be at one place at one time. It is here underneath me, holding me up, and because it is doing that, it cannot be anywhere else. Now, there can be other chairs in other places, like the ones that you're sitting on, and they can all appear to be exactly alike, but the fact is, only one chair can be at one place at one time. Everybody gets that, right? Pretty simple to understand. Okay, let's move from the chair now to the one who's sitting on the chair. Okay, I am a human being. I inhabit a certain time and space. Like the chair, I can only be at one place at one time. Okay? However, unlike the chair, I do have a spiritual capacity. I have a mind that allows me to be at other places at other times. Ollie says it happens all the time, okay? I can remember the past. I can anticipate the future. I can read a book and be transported into another place. I can even create imaginary places, okay, because I have a spiritual capacity. But I am still bound to one place and one time. I have a body, okay? Let's make it a little more complicated. Let's think about like radio waves and cell phone waves. We know that radio waves don't have a body like we do, and yet there are places where they are and places where they are not. This last weekend we were out at family camp at the Prairie View Bible Camp at Ark City. And in most of the places where we were at in the camp, it's down in the valley, you can't get any cell phone signal. But if you hike your way up to the top of the hill at the entrance to the camp, you can get 2 bars of service up there, at least with your Verizon, okay? I don't know what it is with anybody else. Well, those radio waves, those cell phone waves, they don't have a body quite like we do, and yet there is a place where they are and where they are not. They're up on the hill and you can access them, but not in the valley, okay? Let's take it even one step further again. Let's think about beings that we normally call supernatural beings, angels and demons and that sort of thing. Even though angels do not share the same sort of physical body like we have, it is also true they are finite beings and they can only be in one place at one time. Right? Remember the story from the book of Daniel? When Daniel was praying and this angel was dispatched to go and bring Daniel a message, but it took him 3 weeks to get there because he was blocked by the evil prince of Persia, which was a spiritual evil deal. If angels could be anywhere at once, they could just zap the message over there, right? But in this particular case, it had to travel a distance. I don't know if you thought about this or not, but this is also true about Satan. Even though Satan is an angel, he is a finite being and he can only be at one place at one time. It may be very likely that you and I maybe don't register on the scale important enough to have even drawn his attention. Now, he has lots of beings that work for him, and no doubt we have drawn their attention, okay? But Satan does not have the same power that God does. He does not have the same omnipresence, the same omniscience, the same wisdom, okay? They have a kind of body. It's a spiritual body, but it is limited by time and space to at least a certain degree, okay? God is the only being who completely transcends both time and space. He is present everywhere, and everywhere he is present, his full being is present. Now, with that in mind, as we close class here this morning, it's helpful to consider a couple of ways to not think about God's omnipresence. There are some mistakes in this regard, and we want to avoid those mistakes so we think about this accurately. Number one, it would not be right to think about God that he's everywhere because he's stretched out and is really big so that he just fills up everything. The problem with this particular view is that, if that was true, then, perhaps here on Earth we'd have one of his arms, and over on Pluto he's got one of his legs, and out in some far distant galaxy here's his head. Of course, we're describing him like a human body, but whatever form he might take, if he was merely just stretched out, only part of him would be in various parts. Okay, but what are we learning about God? God's not made up of parts. He is the singular thing. He is present everywhere, and everywhere he is present, his full being is present. Okay? So it would not be right to envision God as a corporal kind of being that's simply just stretched out to fill everything, as if part of him's here, part of him there, and that sort of thing. A second mistake we can make in regard to God's omnipresence is to assume that God is somehow intermixed with creation, that creation itself is a part of God. This is the error of what we would call pantheism. You've heard of that before, which says that God is in all created things. So while it's important to note that God is everywhere present, and that includes the creation itself is a separate thing from God. God created the universe. He sustains the universe by his power. But creation's not the same thing as God. It exists independently of him, even though it's sustained by him. And the reason is, it goes back again to this idea that God is not made up of parts. If creation itself was God, then you would have part of God in the tree, part of God in the grass, part of God in the cow, and that's what a lot of people think. People, believe those sorts of things. But God's not made up of parts. He is a singular being, and he is fully present everywhere, and everywhere he is present, his full being is present. That's hard for us to comprehend, but that is what Scripture teaches about God. And so, if you come back to this psalm that we read last week, we now can understand a little more readily why he writes what he does. Where can I go from your spirit, he says. Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, there you are. And if I make my bed in the depths, you're there too. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there, your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. The psalmist is expressing what you and I have just been talking about, and that is that God is everywhere present. There's nowhere we can escape from his presence. And that's both good news and bad news. Because the good news is we're never alone. And the bad news is we're never alone. It just depends on what you're up to, So that's all I have for today. Any questions or thoughts?
To me, it's a comfort.
Yes, that's right.
As a child, I started thinking of Santa Claus a little bit like God.
Right.
As you can see, wherever you are.
Yeah.
And I kind of made that comparison to God.
Yeah.
A little bit, although that's in a child's mind.
Right, sure, right. It forms and changes along the way. Yeah. Yes.
How would you define we were made in his image?
So I think there's several aspects of it. His image is, first of all, that we are morally culpable beings that have rational and ways of making decisions as compared to the animals. We're not just creatures of instinct. His image also has to do with the mission that he has given us to rule over the earth, that God reigns and we are to reign with him. And then also his character, that we participate in his moral character. And so I think that is a large measure what the image means. Yeah. Appreciate y'all sticking with me with this. For the next 2 weeks, we're going to have guest speakers. Next week is our Mission Sunday, and we're going to have a guest missionary, Bill and Gloria Ryan's relative, who does some missionary work in Africa, is going to present here in Bible class. And then the week after that, I'll be gone on vacation for my second week for this year, and Jay will be teaching a class, I think, on Psalm 119 on that Sunday. So in a few weeks, we'll resume, and I appreciate you hanging with me in here with this. I know it's a difficult subject, but I hope you're benefiting from it. So God bless y'all.